Hello, so welcome at my talk today for React Live. So actually, this is a nice catch up for me. As last year was actually this year, it feels like last year already. So this year in February, I was speaker at the frontendlove, which actually was my last in-person event. So yeah, thanks for having me again at React Live. So today I'm going to talk about how you can use TypeScript and GraphQL together to give you React superpowers. So by using both these technologies, you can actually get the best out of React and also yeah, make your tech stack a bit better. So who's this talk actually for? So this talk is for all of you, but especially if you're already familiar with either TypeScript or GraphQL, then this is the best talk for you to get started with using both these technologies together with GraphQL, with React. So a little bit about myself first. So my name is Roy. You can also find me on Twitter with the handle @GetHackTeam. You maybe already follow me. If not, make sure to do so. Over the last years, I worked for a lot of different companies. I gave all sorts of workshops about React, GraphQL, but also TypeScript. I've done open source work for the city of Amsterdam, the city I'm living in. So this recording is coming from Amsterdam at this moment, which you maybe have already, which you probably already have been if you've been to frontendlove this February. And quite recently, I started a new adventure as yeah, at a Dutch renewable energy company, Van der Bron, where I'm leading all the engineering teams, and we're working on products to enforce our mission to supply the world with renewable energy. So enough about that. I also did some other things like writing books about React mostly. So make sure to get them if you didn't already. And if you want to know more about GraphQL or TypeScript after this talk, then you can make sure to find me on YouTube. Just search for my name and you're going to find all sorts of talks regarding TypeScript, GraphQL, but also React. So what do you already know about TypeScript? Usually, I probably would have been in an audience and I could have seen you all and I've shown some hands. So I'm going to assume some of you know TypeScript and some of you have heard about it. Or actually, I'm going to assume most of you have heard about it, but only some of you have actually used TypeScript. So TypeScript is a type superset of JavaScript, which means that it has all the features that JavaScript has. So you're using JavaScript for React. Basically, all the features that you have in JavaScript, you have it in TypeScript as well. The only difference is that TypeScript is typed, which means that every function or method or variable in TypeScript can be recognized by a type. Whereas in JavaScript, you have sort of a dynamic typing, so you don't really know if a date is actually a date or a Boolean would be a Boolean. When you're using just JavaScript, it's basically guessing. So in React, you maybe be using Flow, and Flow is using a similar approach to add types to React, but also to JavaScript in general. And more familiar to the React side, you'll probably be using prop types, which is actually a pretty fine solution. The only problem is it just addresses the props of your component. Well, TypeScript is able to add type definitions to everything that's going on in your React code. So basically, starting from your state management solution to your routing, to the end your data fetching, which we'll be looking at today because GraphQL is about data fetching. Yeah, so maybe this is a small hint, but just as TypeScript has types, GraphQL already has types. But yeah, to sum up what I just told to you, TypeScript is a type superset of JavaScript. It compiles to plain JavaScript. And it uses the latest ECMAScript features. So this is also important to know. It uses the latest ECMAScript features, as you can see here, which means that all the things that you can use in JavaScript, you can already use them in TypeScript as well. And yeah, I already told you, what else has types? It's GraphQL, right? So GraphQL has types just as TypeScript has types, which I've briefly shown in the slides, but I'll show you later on more in depth. What else has types? It's GraphQL. So if you aren't familiar with GraphQL yet, I gave a talk about GraphQL at frontendlove actually. But yeah, to sum it up, what GraphQL is doing, it's a query language for APIs. So let's talk a bit more about GraphQL first, because I feel GraphQL might be newer to you than TypeScript. So GraphQL is a query language for APIs. Basically, that means that you can use GraphQL to query to query an API. And it can be an existing API, it can be a new API, it can be an API tied to a database. And the nice thing about GraphQL is that you can use it platform and framework agnostic. So you're not tied to a specific programming language or to a specific framework or language. And the basic approach of GraphQL is that you're going to ask for something in the exact same format as you receive it back. So if you look at the left-hand side, you can see a document in which you can find which we call a query. And in the query, you can see we're asking for a product with the ID of number 3. You also ask for a title, a thumbnail, a price, and the return of that is a JSON. And the JSON is the same format as our query. So this is something that's very important in GraphQL. Something else that's important to know is it offers a single endpoint for multiple resources. So instead of having to query different endpoints to get your data, you can just query one single endpoint and get the data from multiple resources. So those resources can be a REST API that you wrap with GraphQL. It can also be related to database tables. So what does this look like? So suppose we have a query again. You can see it on the left. So we're sending a document to the query. We're asking for the product information again. This time we also define some relationships. So there's a relationship with categories and there's one with reviews. And you can see for our response that it returns multiple layers. So you can see the relationship with categories actually an array, and the relationship with reviews is just an object. So those relationships are defined in the query and also in the schema. That's why you're able to query them. And your return, they will just be put together. So this is quite different than you might already know from existing REST APIs that you're using with your React API, where you might have to send different requests, have to use things for state management like Redux Saga, Redux Dunks to tie them nicely together. With GraphQL, you don't really need that kind of solutions any longer, because you can define nested relationships. And like I already told you, GraphQL, just as TypeScript, is based on the type system, which means that everything is typed in GraphQL. So you can be pretty sure that there aren't any errors going on build time when your code is being compiled. And this type system in GraphQL is basically the same as the one in TypeScript, which you can see on the left side and also on the right side where the return is being shown. So suppose we have a mutation, which is another form of a query sort of operation. We can send to the Graphql server. You can see there's stuff typed in there. And from the bottom left, you can see we're sending a product ID, which is a string. And from the right, you can see it's actually giving us an error that product ID should be an integer or a number in this case. So we're getting an error, and this is because GraphQL is a type system and it already sees that something is wrong. So you won't be able to actually execute a document with this mutation in it. So that's why a type system in GraphQL is important to help you get started with these kinds of things. And those type systems are very familiar. So they look a lot like each other. They share a lot of basic principles, which is quite easy if you're learning both technologies, or it's even more easier if you already know one of the two. So on the left hand, you can see what a TypeScript type definition would look like. So we have a type called product. There are some fields in there, like an ID, like a title, blah, blah, blah. There's also relationships in there defined with categories and reviews, which you already briefly saw. And then on the right, you can see a GraphQL type definition, which is the same fields in there, just with different numbers and different values. So you can also see this relationship with category and a relationship with reviews, which is quite similar to the things we already saw in one of the previous slides. So both have what we call scholar types, which is like the basic types. They're already in there by default. You don't have to define them yourselves. Both TypeScript and both GraphQL already have these sort of default types in their type system. And they can both relate to other types. And as you can see, the syntax is pretty much the same. And there's one big difference between those two type definitions is that in TypeScript, you're going to define all the fields that you define for a type are required unless you make them default. So with the question mark, you can make them, you can make them optional. And for GraphQL, it's the other way around. We're going to assume nothing is required and everything is optional. So you have to define that they are required by using the exclamation mark. So this is an important difference between the two to understand and really try to grasp. So how can we combine both TypeScript and GraphQL together? There are multiple ways to use them together. They're both pretty much incorporated in the JavaScript ecosystem and also in the React ecosystem, where it makes it really easy for you to get started with either of the two, and even better with both technologies. So looking from a more of a backend side of approach, one thing I really like is TypeGraphQL. It just released the first stable version, which means it in theory is ready for production, but to me it felt like the beta could also be used in production, but I think that's a different discussion. But this is more the backend side of approach. The other approach is using GraphQL code generator, and this is actually sort of a full stack approach because you can use it to create TypeScript type definitions from GraphQL, but you can also do it on the backend. But I believe it's mostly used on the front end, and I guess that's also where it uses that's the most value, because you can use it to also generate Apollo components or Apollo hooks, which I'll show you in a demo later on. So this is a very powerful tool that can really help you to get the most out of both technologies. And it can best be described as a CLI tool. So it means you can run it from your command line, and it will help you to generate TypeScript types from a GraphQL schema. And you won't, as it's a CLI tool, you can also use it from your package.json file and maybe add some scripts to it to actually use it the best. And basically, the source of truth is your GraphQL schema. So if you would continue with using GraphQL code generator, that the GraphQL schema of your server is actually the one that's putting all the defining all the logic in your application. So it's very tightly coupled to your GraphQL schema, and whenever something changes in the schema, you can find those changes using GraphQL code generator. So if we look at those two type definitions, like here, and you see I've turned them around because GraphQL is now our first input, and we're going to generate TypeScript out of it. So yeah, try to remember the things you previously saw. So they both have fields defined. They both have relationships, as you can see, with categories and reviews. And the only thing that's really different is that in GraphQL, all fields are optional, and in TypeScript, all fields are required, unless you, of course, define that they aren't. And based on the types you can see on the right, those things on the left will be generated. So you can see in TypeScript, if you use GraphQL code generator, it defines the basic color types for GraphQL, and it maps them to TypeScript types. So you can see that the ID field in GraphQL will always be a string. A string is, of course, a string, Boolean, Boolean. And you can see integers and floats, they are both converted to numbers. And yeah, so the relationships are still there. So you don't have to worry about those as well. So how does it actually work? You can just install GraphQL code generator using yarn or npm, and then you can just run the CLI tool to do whatever you wanted to do. That's not that exciting. There's also a wizard to get you started, so it will show you where to put the configurations or where the files will be generated. And you can also define your own settings, which is something that I've done. So I'm going to show you a little demo, and in this demo I'm going to show you my setup. So basically what I've created my own configuration for a code generator, and I've linked to an external GraphQL schema. So this external GraphQL schema is my source of truth for all the TypeScript types that will be generated, and it will also be the server where I get my data for my application from. So I've created this application. It's not the prettiest, sorry for that. So let me show you the application first. So this is basically the GraphQL server that I have. Let me see if it's still running. Oh, looks like it isn't running. So to run my GraphQL server, I'm using Code Sandbox. You might already know Code Sandbox. I believe they have some speakers here today as well. So using this Code Sandbox, I have a GraphQL server running just basically from anywhere. So I don't have to do that much setup, and it's just available on Code Sandbox. So let me see, I believe it's ready. So yeah, to give you an example of my GraphQL server, I have a query to get product information, and I also have a relationship with a field called offers, and that has data in it as well. So based on this GraphQL schema and actually the server, I've created a small application, which is basically this. So you can see the data is the same. I didn't spend that much time on the UI because I think the main the main thing you should take from this talk is how to use GraphQL together with TypeScript to add superpowers to your React application. So let's not try and look at the UI as much. Let's look at the logic basically. So what it does, this application is filled by the query from that's sent to this GraphQL server, and we actually want to use this GraphQL server and its schema, which you can find here as well. We want this schema and this query to be available in our application and have it being typed by TypeScript. So that's what I'm going to show you. So let me show you the code actually that I've been working on. So this is the code. This is just to create a React application, and in here you can find I've added some definitions for code generator. I've linked to my code sandbox where my GraphQL server lives. I've showed you where my documents are. So in the documents, I've defined all the queries and mutations and operations and so forth that I want to be strongly typed. So you can see I have a query, it's called get product, and this is the thing. I think it's the same one as I just showed you in the playground, so it would be all good. And in here, I also created the logic to get the data. So as you can see, I'm using Apollo client, which is one of my favorite GraphQL clients. The only downside I always have is that it's quite big. So that's something to think about when you use this in your application. There should be tree shaking, but yeah, just take into account that it can get quite big. And I've created some TypeScript types or interfaces. I've defined my query, which is also in the document. And in here, I'm using the use query hook from Apollo. You can see I've added the type definitions for it. So the type is get product. So this is actually the return type of use query. It will return my products information, returns the data. That is basically what this hook does. And also insert my document into it. And then in here, I've needed to define other interfaces as well, because otherwise it's not strongly typed enough to use query hook. So these types will be undefined. Actually, there could be any in this case, which you don't want. So you have to do sort of double work. So instead, as of typing this one, I also had to type these quite a few. And yeah, looking at my previous slides, you probably already know that we can actually just use Graphical code generator to auto-generate those, right? So let me clear my terminal. In my package.js, I actually created a script for this. So it's yarn generate, and it uses the code generator CLI with my configuration, which can be found here. So the configuration is what I already just showed you. In the configuration, you can find the link to my GraphQL schema and basically my GraphQL server. And you can also find where my documents are put. So with the based on the documents and the queries, and in there, we're going to generate the types. So let me try and do this. Yarn generate, just see if it works. Yeah, so basically it does several things. So it looks like sort of a double step in there, but it should parse the configuration and then it will generate output. So the output is generated in here. And what the GraphQL code generator did is create everything from my GraphQL server into a TypeScript type file. So this is a TSX file. Why TSX? Because we're already also using Apollo client in there for maybe components or maybe for hooks. The color types are defined in here as well. Something not too interesting. You can find here the offer type, which we're using, and also the product type. You can see we also have some deprecated fields in there defined in my GraphQL schema, which is quite a nice addition. Especially if you're using something like code generator, it's interesting to see these kind of examples, because if you would in the end delete it, it will also be deleted from your application. So you can no longer use it in there. And what's more interesting is if you go a bit down, it's the document, which you already saw, is the use get products query. So this is actually the hook based on use query that's been auto-created by this one. So let's take it a bit step back. So get products is the first thing we hardly typed, right? So we're using the Apollo use query hook to get this information, and we had to define this type by ourselves. But let's try and take a step back and see if we can find this file actually in here. So maybe we can already, oh, Control F is enough, I guess. Get products. Let me see if we can find, it'll be easier to go just to the top. Let me see if we can find the type for the query return. So type query, those are all our queries. Get products query. Yeah, we can try this one, see if it's actually typing what we want to type. So import from here. Let's try the other way around. That usually works better. Get products document. Get products. It's a document node. I don't think that's what we're looking for. Get products query. Yeah, let's try and get this one. So import get products query from, it should be somewhere, no, I think it's in the same line. So from generated and GraphQL TSX. So it actually has now exports here because it's this one then, and then we could get rid of this. Yeah. So basically using this, we add this type definition here as well. Now it's going to complain a bit, probably because this is already typed, and this is typed as well. Let me format this a bit. Yeah. So basically what I just did, I had manually defined the return type for my use query hook, which also needed me to put those interfaces in here as well. So by using just this export, I can already use the get products query type from the generated file to actually return something for my hook. And this is just one step, right? Because this way I'm still tied to using Apollo client. Like actually another step you could do is importing something else for here, which is the actual hook. Let me just see if my application is still running. We don't have any issues there. Yeah, we can do it later. Let me just put in the hook here first. So let's go for our use get products query. So this is actually the typed hook that has been returned. So you can see it should basically do the same thing as this use query hook. So let's see if that's actually the case. Use get products query. We don't have any variables defined. So it should be hard typed as well. So it already knows that title is a string, offers is a relationship with offer. And as you can see, we don't need this query anymore because it's already incorporated in the hook. So this is going to help us get rid of a lot of boilerplate. Rid of this one. We also no longer have to import something from the Apollo client, because we can just do it like this. Return types are all the same. So let me try run the application. I must say, I'm not sure if this actually works. I haven't tried it today, but let's see. It should work. All the type definitions are here. Let me go to the browser again. Where's my browser? I believe it is somewhere. It's the one here. No, it's not. Here it is. See if the application is still running. Yeah, so that's good. My application is still running. It's still sending the same query to the server, but instead of having everything typed myself, I've already used the type use get products query from GraphQL code generator. As you can see, there are multiple steps in this process. So the first thing I did actually was trying to replace the already existing use query from Apollo client and use the type definition created by GraphQL code generator. You can also use it directly like this. So this will give you even more freedom because now when something changes, you just have to change the variables you get from data. So with data products has things in there as well. You can already see those are types. So reseller is a string, price is a string, title is a string, ID is a number. These are already typed. And so everything you change something to your schema, you just have to run the generator again. So suppose we change my schema, we just run the generator. It's going to do some things. It's going to parse our configuration. It's going to generate the outputs. And then a new file will be created here, which is the GraphQL TSX file. And in here, you can find all the newly defined things. So suppose I would add a new query. It would return here. Actually, the return type from the query will also be parsed from your schema. And this is all being done automatically. So it's going to save you tons of times. It's also going to make sure that your React application has way less compile errors, also way less build errors, because you don't have to be sure that anything goes wrong. And especially if you run the application, then it feels way safer than prop types. It is way safer than prop types, definitely, because prop types only looks at the types of the props for your component. And in comparison to Flow, it already adds more value because TypeScript actually is a typed language based on JavaScript, which adds way more freedom than just using a library to create types. So yeah, I just showed you how to generate TypeScript types from your GraphQL schema, which is always a sort of truth. That's important to understand. And yeah, so basically this sums up my talk about these two things. So what I've showed you today is not that much React code, sorry for that, but a lot of surrounding technologies like TypeScript and GraphQL, and how you can use them together to auto-generate React code. So it's actually going to save the amount of work you need to do, because you might already be using TypeScript, you might already be using GraphQL, and by combining those two technologies, it's going to seriously reduce the amount of time that you spend on writing React code, and it's seriously going to reduce the amount of time that you spend on debugging calls to your REST APIs or other sorts of APIs. And I think especially if you're already using GraphQL and you're already using React, make sure to add TypeScript to the stack as well, to save yourself a lot of time, to save yourself a lot of debugging. And basically also make the users of your application happier, because they're going to get a way safer application. And something else I really like, which is sort of the final statement for this, if you're already using prop types, the thing I find really hard is at some point you're going to define that much prop types that your React code becomes really unreadable. I think that's a real good point where you should start using TypeScript. So this is a question I usually get from people. When should I start incorporating TypeScript into my React application? I believe you'll pass a certain point where your prop types go too big, you have a lot of logic in your application, and you want the logic to be typed as well. It would be a good starting point to use TypeScript. And the nice thing is you can run TypeScript on multiple ways. And by running TypeScript without a strict mode, you can already start changing files without having to change all the files. So you can slowly migrate over to TypeScript without having to change everything at once. Yeah, so I put in this slide, I put some links as well to the place you can find me on Twitter, or how you can find more talks about me on YouTube. Yeah, some introductions to GraphQL and also to type GraphQL. The documentation from TypeScript itself is really good as well. And most importantly, the link to GraphQL code generator, which is completely open source, which makes it really good for you to use, and really easy. And it's made by a very small company called the Guild. And yeah, always feel free to look at more of the GraphQL tools that they've built, because they've built a ton. So yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and I hope to see you in person sometime soon. Maybe next year at one of the events if the situation changes. Thank you.